Hi, Ross Pluskin here. Welcome to the Top Shelf Aquatics Farm. Today we're going to be continuing our mini-series on flow. In part one, we talked about how flow communicates all the water quality and contextualizes the water chemistry between all the different aspects of the visual aquarium, the filtration at the bottom, and even refugiums. In part two, we discussed the different types of flow and how those affected the means of which solids are either scattered or collected in the aquarium. And now in part three, we're going to start to get into the nitty-gritty, comparing different organisms and their needs of flow, and which organisms might need what conditions of flow and how we might kind of get there. So today we'll be talking about fishes and flow, and we're doing a few different comparisons among common reef aquarium taxa of fish. So we'll be starting off with our old friends, the Acanthuridae, the tangs. So the tangs are one of the most popular aquarium fish of all time. And more commonly, they're purchased at smaller sizes. Now it's very tempting for someone to want to buy a tang and put it in a small tank, and one of the many reasons why they might not have success at first is not having sufficient flow for that animal. Now look at these animals behind me, look at these tangs. They are literally swimming inside something akin to a washing machine. That rock is shaking, there's so much flow, yet the fish almost seem comfortable hovering in place even when they're surrounded by the daggers and protrusions of the Montipora and Acropora. How can this be? Well, it's because pelagic tangs have adapted themselves to be able to live in these high flow reef environments. They have muscles that are adapted to be able to coordinate around these various structures so that they can operate, graze, and enjoy their normal life. But at the same time, they expect this constant deployment of flow. There's some areas of slack tide in the wild, but for the most part, these fish have muscles. They were born and raised, and they'll die in the wild on a treadmill. So we have to offer something similar in the aquarium. This is where power heads are very helpful with species like this that need a lot of flow, and even in a big tank won't be very happy at all unless they're constantly being somewhat stimulated by erratic flow of some kind. In many cases, providing sufficient flow and space can even be a limiting factor as to which fish can be kept in captivity long term. Big fish, pelagic species such as tuna and mahi-mahi, for example, require ridiculous amounts of flow that simply cannot be offered in even most public aquarium settings. So they're very difficult to keep. Speaking of public aquariums, and even in the reef tanks, most aquariums are square in nature, which can be a huge limiting factor when it comes to more pelagic species of fish, or even more robust swimming reef fish species such as powder blue tangs. These are commonly attributed with not having enough space to swim in, and benefit, frankly, greatly from having circular structured tanks. A big obstacle that's engaged in the reef aquarium industry, and certainly in the public aquarium industry, is the keeping of sharks. Without having complex flow, even in a circular tank, sharks will only swim on one side. Many pelagic fish will just swim on one side unless they are challenged by randomized flow and structure to also randomize and complicate that flow. So, in order to get around this and keep pelagic species from tangs and other high flow species all the way up to charismatic sharks, it's very important to be able to have power heads that are running strong, running around structure, and even potentially running on an alternating or even erratic schedule to provide the same kind of stimulation that those mussels would enjoy in the pelagic environment. So for tangs, highly recommended to engage in a high flow environment, but we'll be doing a comparison to some other species that might enjoy a little bit more of a moderate, structured, and even a low flow environment. So let's go find some of those. Why, we're in the retail store now, and we have some wonderful examples of what I would consider moderate flow fish. So unlike some of the pelagic species we discussed, and certainly some of the open water tangs that demand constant stimulation from something like a power head providing strong and even randomized flow around structure, these are fish that are a little bit more accommodating to life in the reef and all the various forms of flow that it could have. See here some engineer gobies that are completely adept at being able to live in dead zones of reef where they're crawling underneath rocks, making tunnels that have very minimal flow. But at the same time, you can see here they are somewhat competent just existing out in the middle of the water column as well to a limited degree. Clownfish, damselfish are another good example where they can make excursions, soirees into the open water and kind of hold out a little bit into the flow, but they're much more comfortable being associated around structure and a moderate level of flow that, provides them still some food and, some flow to keep their waist, constantly moving. But at the same time, they certainly can't handle the full strength blast that something like an Achilles tang can take. Then we have something like the scissortails as well, which a little bit more open water, kind of full time, but don't require constant strong flow. They can kind of be satisfied more or less with just a modest level of power head and maybe even a stronger mainline flow as well. So these are all good examples of fish that are what I would consider moderate flow. Now let's go see some that definitely enjoy lower end of the flow spectrum. Now we're here in the invert section of the retail store, and we're starting to see some fish that definitely benefit from a lower flow environment. This is not to say they can't handle levels of flow and that they don't need flow, obviously, to preserve their water quality, but they cannot handle the same surge and power that something like an Achilles tang can take. Achilles tangs live in this water break zone where water collapses and it's essentially a giant waterfall all the time. Something like these lionfish live amongst the rocks in the lower parts of the reef where the flow is relatively controlled and stable. They are designed, see, everything about them is to go low and slow, stay towards the bottom, not to have to fight the current too much, and then to be able to maneuver slowly and preserve that camouflage that they have. We see things similar, such as poison gobies and yellow clown gobies that just stay in position. They don't need to constantly be moving all the time. In fact, most of the time, they can actually be quite sedentary. Other good examples are things like mandarin dragonettes. Certainly enjoy a somewhat lower flow environment so that they are free to use their tiny little fins to maneuver around the rocks and hunt all the copepods and other forage that they have. And for another example, let's look at some pipefish and some seahorses. A wonderful example of a fish perhaps on the lowest aspect of the flow spectrum. Something like a very small pipefish like this one right here. Look at how, even though it's able to compensate for the flow somewhat, it certainly enjoys having areas where there's lower flow, where it can peruse around these rock structures and hunt its various forage. So really, we can see here that even though all fish require some areas of rest, even a tang will rest on the side of a rock at night, and all fish require flow to provide removal of their waste and to stimulate their muscles somewhat and provide food supply heading towards them. There's certainly a huge degree of discrepancy between the tiny locomotion and needs of something like this pipefish or the scooter blenny compared to the fish that we saw in Sherwood a little while ago, braving the open flow of multiple power heads spurting at multiple directions. So this has been a little bit of a comparison when it's come to the various different types of fish and the flow requirements they might need. And I strongly encourage you, when designing your aquarium and your reefs, to try and find fish that either A, can exist in multiple different areas of flow that you provide in the aquarium, or B, try and find fish that all complement and have a similar need if there's a majority high flow or majority low flow environment. And it's decisions like this that are the difference between beautiful success and having your fish run on a very fast treadmill. We'll see you next time.